Ahojte moji milí tretiaci, pozdravujem vás ako tradične týždeň dopredu, aj 2 týždne dopredu, pre niektorých, ak to pozeráte neskôr. My máme dnes na škole príjmačky a vy máte riaditeľské voľno a to isté asi je aj ten deň, keď Bčkarom posielam hodinu a samozrejme Cčkari vy máte v piatkové hodiny klasicky. No a už viete, že minule som to spravil tak, že som vám aj tak poslal link s tým, že ste mohli teda mi posielať alebo máte teda odozdávať vaše zadanie 16. mája. Čiže ja som vám to o týždeň posunul oproti tomu, čo sme mali možnosť robiť. No a v podstate dúfam, že je všetko v poriadku. No. Samozrejme, hej, riaditeľské voľno bolo také, že nedalo sa inak spraviť, takže dúfam, že ste si to pozreli a využili. Ak vám tam téma chýba, decka, tak určite vám budem nejaké body sťahovať a o stupeň, o 2 možno bude známka horšia. Takže dúfam, že ste splnili tie pokyny a všetko bude OK. No, my dnes začneme, teda ja dnes začnem a vy sa popri tomu budete prispôsobovať, aspoň dúfam, a novou témou, ktorú ja som tak súhrne nazval revolutions, revolúcie. Sú to 3 krajiny, ktoré budeme rozoberať približne od toho 17. storočia až do 18. a 19. a ich následky máme v politike, v politických systémoch a vo formách štátneho zriadenia. Takže pomerne také dôležité témy sú to, no a venujú sa v podstate tomu, čo nazývame 2 anglické revolúcie, alebo aj vznik britského parlamentného systému. V podstate všeobecne to vznik konštitučnej monarchie. No následne to vznik a vývoj Spojených štátov amerických, ktorí zase zakladajú republiku prezidentského typu. No a nakoniec to bude Francúzsko, ktoré prešlo také veľmocenské pozície až do Veľkej francúzskej revolúcie a napoleonského obdobia, ktoré bude výrazne formovať v podstate ďalšie tie smery a to je najmä v podstate republiku parlamentného typu, ktorú poznáme aj z Európy, ale aj cisárstvo, ktoré v podstate nejaký spôsob kopíruje to, čo sa dialo napríklad v Rímskej ríši. No v podstate zo všetkých troch vychádzajú nám také dôležité dokumenty, ktoré výrazne posilňujú a menia štát a v podstate najmä v 20. storočí množstvo krajín prejde na niektorých z tých typov demokracií alebo toho štátu ohľadom najmä spravodlivosti pred súdom aj pre bežných obyvateľov, likvidácie nejakých tých feudálnych vzťahov, čiže právomoci šľachty, vplyvu cirkvi na štát napríklad, ale zároveň aj politickým a občianskym právam pre obyvateľov týchto krajín. No, vy už asi ste už nešťastní, že vám tu ukazujem zadanie. Vzhľadom na to, že od 16. mája my, ak dobre odhadujem, máme už len nejakých 6 týždňov do konca školy. Ja predpokladám, že aj s uzatváraním známok nebudeme mať viac ako 4 až 5 hodín. Určite neprejdeme tieto témy všetky naraz, takže ja predpokladám, že ak sa neuvidíme v škole do konca roka, čo je možno, že aj hej, tak budeme pokračovať v septembri. Nikto z nás ešte nevie povedať, ako bude sa vyvíjať situácia za tie 3-4 mesiace, takže ja preto vám ešte nedávam zadanie ďalšie, ale poviem vám, že čo asi by sa dialo. Sú 2 možné scenáre. Prvý je ten, že skôr či neskôr znovu príde 3. vlna a znovu bude nejaká uzávera, takže my budeme pokračovať v tom prípade ďalej a v tom prípade budete musieť pokračovať ďalej v zadaní. Tí, čo ste vravili, že zadanie bolo už náročné, alebo že nebolo naopak náročné, tak áno, bolo to jedno z tých prvých a hneď ďalšie, aj toto je trošku také, že väčšie, aj obsahom a aj prácou. No. Okrem toho, že budete musieť poctivo sledovať hodiny, tak možno si budete musieť niečo googliť aj sami. Je dosť možné, že ešte doplním niektoré z tých pokynov, že napríklad v tejto tabuľke bude musieť byť, dajme tomu, 50 pojmov k videám, že čo musíte napísať. Niečo budete musieť aj kresliť. Vždy pri každom napíšem, že či môžete použiť nejaké IT stuff, takže pozor na to. No toto sú veci, ktoré vy sami budete musieť hľadať. Čiže tam bude, a nie o tom, že len čo vás učím, ale že trošku si pohľadáte, heuristika sa to nazýva, budete objavovať a vyberať vy sami. No čiže sú tu také zaujímavé veci, ale ak v podstate sa s tým nebudete nejako, ak si to rozdielite, tak nebude problém. No, potom po Británii pokračuje Amerika a po Američanoch máte nejaké mapky, vyplňať tabuľky, množstvo nejakých pojmov, ktoré mnohé budem spomínať, mnoho len tak hneď zapíšete, ale niektoré, ak nebudete sledovať hodinu, tak treba si ich zapísať, no a teda vyhľadať. Toto určite budete hľadať. No a potom máte aj Francúzsko. No a to je v podstate pomerne krátke, jednoduché. Takže čo je dôležité, decká, čo je dôležité pre mňa, je to, že ak my sa dostaneme do školy a budeme aj v septembri v škole, tak budeme písať z toho normálne písomky. To sa ešte dohodneme, že či si rozdelíme Britov a Američanov, alebo Francúzov k tomu prihodíme. Aj to je možné. V tom prípade toto mi nebude treba. Ak však sa vám pozdáva, že radšej si to doma pripravíte, že máte na to priestor, možno, že v júni toho budete mať paradoxne menej, neviem, ak viac, tak nejde vám to preto ani zadávať, ale tí, ktorí chcete, tak môžete sa do toho pustiť. A ja by som to spravil tak, že ak budeme aj písať písomku, tak tí, ktorí mi toto odovzdajú, poctivo pekne vypracované, tak budú oslobodení z písomky z testu a dostanú známku ako z tohto. Čiže ak tam budete mať odkazy, dobre zapísané zdroje, budete mať všetko vyplnené ako má byť, tak máte v podstate isté jednotky. Dobre? Takže je to na vás, decká, ale zatiaľ odteraz máte v podstate po odovzdaní tohto testu z Habsburskej monarchie máte zatiaľ veget. Jediné samozrejme, čo od vás budem ďalej požadovať, decká, tak je samozrejme reagovať mi na otázky, čo Bčkari nemuseli minulý týždeň, pretože mali ste teda riaditeľské voľno. Cčkari samozrejme reagujú, niečo som sa vás opýtal. Teraz v tejto chvíli ešte neviem, čo viete, že mám 3. mája, takže uvidíme ďalej. Dobre, tieto 3 témy, kde ich nájdete? Nájdete ich tak ako ostatné na Logical Geography. Sú tam poznámky, ktoré sú 3, možno 4. Sú to buď wordové poznámky, počkajte, to nie sú oni samozrejme, že si ich pohľadáme. The Birth of English Parliamentary System. Takto sa volajú, vyzerajú asi takto, trošku iný font a majú iba 4 strany a množstvo obrázkov. Ja som ich trošku doplnil a už som ich aj upravil na prezentáciu, podľa ktorej ja pôjdem, čiže to bude táto. No a v podstate myslím, že navyše tam toho textu ani veľmi nie je, možno pri niektorých témach bude niečo doplnené. Doplnil som jeden textík, to bude hlavne pre seminaristov, maturantov a potom zaujímavé veci, kde som sa snažil vám možno ukázať, že keď dopady do súčasnosti. Aj pri Američanoch pôjdeme až do 20. storočia, ale bude to v podstate dôležité, aby ste pochopili možno, ako funguje politický systém, politické strany aj u nás. A toto sú veci, ktoré si prejdeme na týchto hodinách, čiže bude to zaujímavé. Ďalšie témy, ktoré tam máme, ak by ste chceli sami si študovať postupne, tak máte USA, vývoj USA, či Formation Development of USA. Rovnako ja pôjdem podľa prezentácie, to isté Francúzsko a tiež mám prezentáciu. Čiže myslím, že sa oplatí tie hodiny sledovať, lebo budete vidieť trošku iný spôsob, že ako to asi vyzerá. Okay, guys, I'm switching back to English because probably you have missed it. So I believe that you'll be okay with this. So the topic in here is called, with 2 names that I have already told you, it's the birth of the British parliamentary system. It's not only about England, but the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland today, but at that time it was also whole Ireland and many other colonies around it. We call the British Commonwealth. Or the Commonwealth generally. Still, there were many events that dramatically changed the state. They changed the form of government, so how English kings and queens were ruling, and how people could participate on not electing the king, obviously, but electing the people in the parliament. Because these 2 events, major event, because there are many of them, among them and around them, so they changed the state, changed the form of the government, so we call it revolution. Despite the second revolution, I wouldn't say it's a revolution, it was just new agreement between the people, I mean their representatives, and the king. Okay, who accepted the new situation? Because sometimes you don't need to accept it. You can end up like in French history with your head rolling somewhere down the stairs from the executioner's stage. Okay, studying material is for you if you have some books in here, and if you don't, so sorry. Ask next time. The last time we talked about England, about English-speaking peoples, were the times of Reformation, and you remember that that was case of Henry VIII and how he established the Anglican Church, and the succession of this of the Tudors with the end of the rule of Elizabeth the First. But I need to erase this dot because we don't use it anymore. And this was the thing that she refused to get married, and due to this fact she did not have any children, thus any heirs to the throne. It was actually interesting because since the times of this Battle of Bosworth, this famous marriage of Henry and Elizabeth of Lancaster and York, so they created this whole lineage, but suddenly we have Elizabeth as the last of the members of the house of the Tudors. Since she didn't have any heirs, so the succession moved to the kings of Scotland, and that were the stewards, so-called the stewards. And these guys at the time, queens, there were two queens, they did not somehow they didn't have ambitions to get the English throne. Still, Elizabeth I started to take it really seriously what to do with this. And firstly, she, for example, sent Mary the Steward, that could have been the successor to the throne, to that despite now in this famous scene she's asking for forgiveness, that she would not claim the throne of England. She refused that, and she sent her to death, and she was executed. Still, Mary the Steward, she had a son, and despite her son, James I of Scotland, was her, at the times of Scotland was the sixth one, but as you can see in here, the first of James I of England, he was actually, he somehow persuaded Elizabeth that he would be like good king for them, and she changed her opinion. She made up her opinion, and she allowed him to get to the throne, gave him a permit to the throne, and thus, after the death of Elizabeth, the House of Stuart started to rule in England with James I. Actually, he didn't. Maybe somehow he forgave Elizabeth that she had killed his mother, but the point was that James I now was happy that suddenly kings of Scotland were ruling in England. This was interesting because most of people refused this fact. For Scots it was a great thing, like Czechs ruling in Germany, with Charles IV, but the point was that he had support from high nobility that he tried to seize support from, and he tried to rule within the ideas of absolutism. That was not very popular in England, since the times that in England there was no serfdom anymore. It was abolished somewhere in Middle Ages. Still in Habsburg monarchy, as you know, or in Russia, there was still serfdom. That we had lessons about that. So many people disliked it, and that's why when he died and his son started to rule, so there were many attempts to bring them down. Among them, there was so-called the Gunpowder Treason, and there was a guy, Guy Fawkes, who organized kind of a plot against the king, and even before the coronation, there were plans that they installed and brought a lot of barrels with gunpowder under the House of Parliament and to Canterbury Cathedral, and during the coronation, not only the king but even most of the Parliament members should be killed in huge explosions. That was actually revealed. And this plot against the king was revealed, and it was stopped. So this is an interesting thing, but one of the evidence is that probably English, not all the English accepted that suddenly from this coat of arms of Scotland, you have combination and English and Scottish flag together. Okay, like it is today, but English later on understood that it's a good thing to organize something else. Then we have son of James the First, who tried to rule in absolutism, and he tried to rule just like his father and even more. The problem was where that actually in his homeland in Scotland they started some uprisings and rebellions. And he needed, of course, to raise the army and invade Scotland. In order to do that, because at that time you have soldiers, not like you just summon all nobility to fight, but at that time you have these mercenaries who need to operate their firearms, handguns, march in formation, fight with halberdiers. It's not so easy, and that's why most of time of the warfare of 30 Years' War, because it is period of the 30 Years' War, you need mercenaries who can operate these guns, And for that reason, he needed to raise the taxes in order to collect enough money to pay the army. So he called up the parliament, and because his father and even himself they had disrespected the parliament, so the members of parliament got very angry, and when they were summoned in the House of Lords, so they proclaimed to be the Long Parliament, because they expected they would not pass any acts and approve any deeds and decisions of the king, of Charles I of Stuart, until he would accept their own policy and accept the decisions of the parliament. And they proclaimed that they would sit down until he accepted. For that reason, they said actually for many years, it was not like they were sitting there, but the kind of lawyer or judicial act of having one meeting of parliament lasted for many years. Despite these guys were at home, were fighting, some of them dead. But since the first decision, you need to have kind of like procedure, it's called procedural law, and you have to end it out with some agreement and voting about the decision and so on. This is how every parliament or assembly works. So in this way, they were officially de jure sitting for many years. That's why we call it the Long Parliament. And in this way, it was kind of rebellion of English, not only nobility, low nobility, but also towns, partially clergy against the king. And they actually stood against the king's policy. So MP is another abbreviation that is important for you to know, because it means poslanec. Člen parlamentu is used like member of parliament, and MP means poslanec. Okay, so what happened? What followed after this? During the upcoming years in 1640s, these actually rebellion of the king of the parliament caused that king reacted in the thing that they start to call the First Revolution of England. Some people call it also the Bloody Revolution of England, and it was first of two. And how did King react? So he reacted in the way that he dismissed the parliament in 1642, for which, of course, members of parliament refused to accept it, since we have Magna Carta Libertatum in 1215. And they start to protest. But when King sent some soldiers, still some of them want to sit in the parliament, so they dismissed them. And because even the MPs had their own armies and mercenaries, so they start to fight. And from these clashes in the parliament, there was actually the beginning of open civil war in England between so-called the royalists. Royal, in English, it means the supporters of the king's policy, so that's royalists, and the supporters of parliament, and we can call them parliamentarians. Among the guys who were in the kind of command of these parliamentary armies, definitely the most important, the most famous, and decisive for upcoming events would be this guy at his young age, Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell was from middle class nobility, but he proved to be excellent military commander, and with his charisma, excellent leader even of the parliament. Still, parliament was not a single body with single opinion. That they were representatives of towns, of high and low nobility, and so on. Since the times that during the Tudor period, especially in this Elizabethan era, England had changed so much that even society was very different. Not only nobility, but especially people in the town. So for that reason, in the parliament, there were four main fractions. And they also created kind of various forces. You may remember that in the Hussite times we had already representatives of high, low nobility, of towns, of some radicals, and they representing different opinions what to do with the king. And very similar situation happened in England 200 years later, that you have four of these. Firstly, there were Presbyterians. You know that Presbyterian is one of the names of the Methodists, of these Protestant Calvinist churches. These guys were actually high nobility, mostly of Anglican church, but as you can see, Presbyterians, many of them were Scots. These guys, despite they were members of parliament, so they were against the king. So in this way, because of their high rank, high position society, they were pretty moderate towards the king and solutions. So we can say that they were conservative, and from these Presbyterians, later Conservative Party will be created. Then there were middle class members who were mostly mayors of big major towns in England and some like middle nobility, I would say. That's why they were called independents, because they were not so decisive, not so radical, either to the king or either to the parliament. And then there were other guys called levelers. As you can see, this is manifest from levelers, and from their name you can probably guess that these guys were calling for more equal society in this way. Still, it was before Enlightenment, so it was not something that I taught you previous lesson about Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Denis Diderot. Still not yet. In England, they just claimed that maybe some rights and liberties should be same for everybody. Still, for the king and for conservatives, for moderate, that can be pretty different. So these guys seem to be really radical in the parliament. Okay, then these are diggers, and they also issued their own manifest and for the parliament. And these guys were mostly from countryside. It doesn't mean that they were like peasants or something. No, not at all. But usually they were like even sometimes even high nobility, but owning large fields. And because since there were no serfs anymore, so they were paying their peasants. So they were like big plantation owners, okay? So something like even today you have a guy who owns a huge fields, and he got like thousands of employees. So these guys were sometimes conservative, still accepting new situation, and they wanted to have peace within the country, so they could actually like produce more and more food and so on. So we can say that they were farmers, but really big farmers, like millionaires. Despite of this fact, they called themselves even like diggers, that the digging and holes, they started like farmers, but later on they became like these guys. What was important, guys, that who decided what to do in the army, and as you will see during the course of the Civil War, or this first revolution, what to do with the king, for example. And that was the thing that in this case, independents and levelers were decisive, because levelers wanted to usually to proclaim something more like open-minded, more liberal, today we would say, without the king, maybe some brand new revolution in here. Presbyterians usually supporting some compromise with the king, but and diggers usually on the side of Presbyterians. But once independents moved to levelers ideas, so even diggers did. So in this case, many people call it, like in this book, the leveler revolution. That was not actual revolution of common people like diggers in the countryside, but it's not. So England is not a free people till the poor have no land and have free allowance to dig and labor the common. So you see that even the diggers had like really ideas very different from ideas that we know in here. Okay, guys, so let's move on. After the 3 years of battles between the king and the parliament. Finally, decisive battle of the 17th century for England was the Battle of Naseby in 1645, after which Oliver Cromwell, victorious, greeting by his cuirass, horsemen, raiders. So the King Charles was imprisoned, and now the parliament, sitting again, they had to decide what to do with the king. And now they started a conflict between Presbyterians and Levelers, because once one conservative wanted to release the king and maybe to force him to sign up some new Magna Carta Libertatum, the trade charter, but Levelers claimed that they would probably send king to death. This actually renewed the civil war, but between Presbyterians and Levelers. And this is happening very often, guys, that after many conflicts, especially when you have more fractions in here, so usually the former allies start to fight each other. This happened with Sparta against Corinth after the end of Peloponnesian War. This happened after the Second World War with Soviet and USA Cold War, and so on. During these events, King, with the support of his followers, managed to escape from the prison. He escaped to Scotland, and he started to fight again. For that reason, because Levelers accused Presbyterians that they probably helped King to escape, and only with these arguments they gave him enough time to prepare his escape. For that reason, the independents and diggers supported Levelers, and they banished Presbyterians from the parliament, so they were being expelled from the parliament. And in this case, radicals seized power in the parliament. And later on, okay, you cannot see this picture. This is actually questioning the King Charles in here. But what happened after some years, after some months? Radicals, these like Levelers, decided what to do with the king and with the kingdom, thus, and they decided that it was kind of a treason of the king for the country, because according to the Great Charter, king, from their point of view, was obliged to follow their instructions. Since he didn't do that, so he committed a treason for the state, Vlastizrada, and when he was captured for the second time, so he was decided to be executed, which was done in 1649. And in this famous painting, you see a couple of scenes: Charles I before the execution and after the execution, with the executioner in his hand. As you can see, there are ladies fainting in the crowd, collapsing, many people looking around, scaring, and not cheering very much, because that was actually the first execution of the king by his own people in any state of Europe. Of course, some kings were being killed, but usually in the battles or assassination from their family or from some plotters against him. This was first time when something that was supporting the king decided the king must be executed. So many people expected kind of a revenge of the god and like 7 strikes of Egypt coming to England, which didn't happen. But once you kill the king, how the country should look like that. And this is moment of revolution, because you are going to experiment with something. And the English decided that when the king is dead right now, it is time for attempt one experiment, and that was called republic. Yes, we know republic from ancient Rome. You know it very precisely, with senators and dictators and so on. But still, in those times, there were some republics around, and that was in Italian peninsula. And there were these famous naval states that you know from the Age of Discoveries, like the Republic of Venice, Republic of Genoa, and there are some small republics around like Modena and so on. So from the experience of how those states were working, so they were based upon kind of like merchants' assemblies, there were no other people than craftsmen and mayors of the town, who elected only military commander, condottieri, in the Republic of Florence, for example. So they realized that the parliament is pretty enough. They just need one guy who could actually bring these acts passed by the parliament brought these acts, zákony, into the practice using his military power. At the time, they didn't have any ideas about the Supreme Court, about the president, so that was just repetition of something that was working in times of ancient Rome, and especially Italian city-states in, let's say, late Middle Ages. For that reason, Republic of England was declared, and they decided that there would be one executive leader and the main chief commander of English army. That was nobody else than Oliver Cromwell. He was given a title since he was a lord, so he was called Lord, but they call him Protector. That he would be the guy ruling, like commanding army that should protect England and the Parliament. Thus, Lord Protector. Aj po slovensky budeme hovoriť tento titul, normálne tam doslovne slovenčina preberá tieto názvy Lord Protector, či pán ochranca. Lord Protector. But Oliver Cromwell, despite very famous and very popular at the beginning, it was not so easy because since he was not only Protestant but he was a Puritan, and you know that these guys were Calvinists, and they were more, I would say, radical concerning moral behavior, hard work, and so on. So what he did was that he actually marched into the Parliament as a Lord Protector. He actually forced MPs to follow his policy, and because he controlled the army, so despite of the refusal of MPs, as you can see, they are all angry, so he didn't mind, and he just took the coronation spectre, for example, of the king and of the chief of the House of Lords, and just proclaimed his own dominance above the Parliament. So it very quickly turned out to be from republic, as we know it, like democratic, into authoritarian dictatorship of Cromwell himself. So despite it was republic, but it was dictatorship, just like in 20th century. Those who opposed him, so he sent his army, and that's why all this period of republic and this protectorate was typical for bloody reprisals. The other thing is that he also kept this English army being modernized all the time, and just like Swedish army gave them interesting example how to raise an army with, and how shires should keep the army, finance them. So his new model army was kind of model army for other big armies with mercenaries, but also with compulsory military service. Thanks to the army, he held power in England in here. Thanks to this, on the other hand, and usually this dictatorship regimes are typical for that they are then powerful and thus successful abroad, usually when they are like aggressive, he, for example, managed to conquer Scotland again, so the former Stewards kingdom was occupied. The other thing that he also issued was so-called the Navigation Act, že zákon o moreplavbe. That was interesting thing that actually gave inspiration to the Americans later on, and it is the kind of act that you proclaim and you feel so powerful, so strong that you expect everybody else from other countries, from other world to respect it. And it was the thing that English proclaimed their own dominion about the seas, and they proclaimed that in order to protect their sea trade against the concurrence, at the time it was against the Dutch Republic, so they proclaimed that they can attack Dutch ships anywhere in the world. It is something that Americans later took on with the James Monroe Doctrine, in which that they can send their army anywhere. This was interesting thing that tried to keep kind of rotation of the trade between Africa, America, and Europe, but at the same time, English actually became like more than superpower. In times of Elizabeth, they just defeated Spain, but they didn't expand so much. Francis Drake sailed around the world twice. Okay, cool, fine, but that's all. They had some colonies in North America, in Africa, but that was all. Okay, they didn't expand to India, not yet. So for that reason, it was kind of a brand new thing that English will be very aggressive and attacking not only Dutch in South Africa, in India, in Indonesia, in South America, but even other colonies, especially Portuguese in many other countries, like in India, for example. Okay, The second thing that he established, that you see that he now depicted as a great ruler with some Greek letters because there was some inspiration in ancient times, but he's ruling about the other, like a colossus, like a giant, ruling about the peoples of England and various symbols all around. But this is more how it looked like, that armies marching for him, new middle army, and people being like a bit scared. You cannot see this part, but there are slaves in here brought to Caribbean. From Caribbean, they start the production with rum, with tobacco, with cotton, and produce them here in Americas with furs, and these raw materials were brought to Europe, and here in Europe they were processed from like tools and furniture and textiles, and they were being like exported back to the colonies. So this is something what Navigation Act allowed for England, that they start to change their economy from general like variously oriented crafts and manufacturers. They start to be oriented in processing these raw materials, and not only from colonies like wood and furs and products of the slavery, but also from Scotland and Ireland, and that was wool, sheep wool. Okay, so what another picture depicts what the Navigation Acts look like. So protection means that even their colonies could not export it anywhere. So English coming to America don't export any hats, woolens of iron, since these things are already made in England. You can't export anything except in English is colonial ships. Send tobacco to England. Take that cargo to England to be taxed before you land it in the colonies. So that was kind of protection for them that made English really strong and powerful. But on the other hand, gradually caused discontent in the colonies, especially when more and more people were coming in here. Final thing is in here to persuade. Let's say American colonies in America, in India, in Africa, but even Scotland and Ireland that was being invaded by New Model Army at the time. So Oliver Cromwell, with the approval of Parliament, of course, that was obeying him because nobody wanted to get to prison or be executed. So instead of the monarchy of England, because when you're a Republic of England, why Scots should obey you? You are not the king, So he created something new, that they can join this republic in the so-called the Commonwealth. To, čo nazývame dnes spoločenstvo, britské spoločenstvo národov. So that was the beginning, that there was union. They didn't call it like that, but they called it Commonwealth of England, of Scotland, and even Ireland, but there were actually other colonies in here. And since today, the British Commonwealth is alliance of former British colonies with their homeland. But instead of royal coats of arms, there is coat of arms of Oliver Cromwell himself. So he's becoming like dictator, like the king, and these are the flags of this Commonwealth of English Republic. In 1660, finally, Oliver Cromwell dies, and many people said like, oof, reveal, like when Joseph Stalin died, the tyrant, the dictator. But what was decided, that his son was supposed to rule. Actually, he knew the situation, and very quickly, when Parliament was summoned again, they started to criticize, and actually they called for the execution of young Cromwell, but he himself gave up and said, yeah, I know how my father was ruling, so I'm just giving up my powers in order to you, Parliament, and you can decide what to do. I have no power in here. I don't want to be like my father. So after bad experience with the Republic, now the Parliament, that of course denied Cromwell Jr. to be the next Lord Protector, so they decided, what about trying out kings again? Charles I, he was stubborn and he was proud and so on. But what about his sons? Because he had two sons, and both of them seemed like more willing to be okay. So they decided to restore the monarchy. And restoration of monarchy is also called the Steward monarchy, čiže reštaurácia znamená miesto, kde doplníte sily, čiže obnovíte sily, a obnovenie znamená reštaurovanie nielen budovy alebo nejaké knihy, ale reštaurovanie znamená aj návrat nejaké dynastie na trón. So the Steward Restoration was the return of the Stewards, House of Stewards, to the throne of England. So restoration of monarchy in this case happened in 1660s, and the king started to rule. So this is picture how Oliver Cromwell was depicted at like holding like the nobility under his hand, like other bowing down, the other pulling out the intestines, and actually ruling like the king in here, and bloody reprisals and people being burned in the stake. So kind of propaganda, but it didn't look very different from here. And this is the scene that you cannot see it, but again, House of Lords in the Parliament discussing, talking that what about giving this power of the stewards back to the throne. And this happened that the stewards came back to the throne with Charles II. So as you can see, this kind of allegory that he will come back from his exile from France. He came back with great glory, with his armies coming back with flags, and will come back into England. But what happened? Now we have King Charles II, and as a son of beheaded king, that is interesting. That was same thing with James I. He didn't mind it very much, and he was kind of like happy that he was a king, and he didn't protest against the parliamentary policy. So as somebody claimed about him, he didn't say anything stupid, but anything clever neither. So no, we have double negative in one sentence, but you can divide it with some sentence. But the problem started when his son came to the throne, and that was James II. And James II, he tried to restore absolutism, so he did the same mistake as his grandfather. So the parliament now, in order to prevent another civil war, he decided to banish him from England before some civil war would be opened again. So he was banished in 1688 again, and now Parliament had to decide what to do with him. And this is a picture when Louis XIV, great king of France, is welcoming his brother at arms, I would call brother at monarchy, that is exiled James II. Jakub II. Steward, anglický král, coming to France to exile again. So now what England can do? Nobody would remember them because, for example, Charles II, I can't tell you many things he did, and the only even movie that I could remember was this Johnny Depp's movie, The Libertine, one of the most boring movies of Johnny Depp, and maybe only like pure historians, and even I was like kind of sleepy. I was kind of lost in the events happening there. And that was actually the guy who was one of the members of parliament from the House of Lords that was defending the king's policy in order to persuade with his great rhetoric skills the lords that we should keep the monarchy and not to come back to republic. What about James II? Even James II didn't have anything interesting, anything important in here, that only the act that even Charles II was offered, but James II had to accept, to agree, and that was one act that Parliament passed, and is very important for upcoming events. That's habeas corpus. Habeas corpus, obvious Latin words, as you can see. Habeam, it means, you remember habani, is like habeas, it is to have. Okay, corpus in Latin, it is body, human body. So habeas corpus is the act about having your own body. What does it mean? Everybody got your body. The problem is that concerning law, in medieval times, or in times of serfdom, or in times of even these monarchies in here, you don't have your body, and your body belongs to the king or to the parliament. That means that you can go to prison, you can be tortured, you can confess to the things you didn't do. And this was period when already this scientific revolution was there, and many people realized, like, how can somebody be like in prison and tortured and forced to say something he doesn't want to say, or she doesn't want to say, but it rarely happened, and women were being oppressed at that time. So it was kind of act in which for law, for the law. If somebody was accused, he cannot be accused of committing crime without any evidence, without any proof. There had to be a trial held where there were judges and even some representatives, some people from among the folks who decided whether there is like real charge with an evidence proof that he had committed some crime. And with no charges, you cannot be imprisoned. That was kind of things that were common, not only during the kings, but even during Oliver Cromwell. So this was important act in which in England, since that time, any individual could protest against unlawful imprisonment without charges. So it means that if you did something bad, there must be some evidence, there must be some lawful procedure, something that Romans had already had in ancient times is coming to England even before the Enlightenment. And that made the country very different. Already you see, 9 years before banishing James II from England, we have already act that is providing great, not freedom, but the right of any person, even the poorest peasant, beggar in London and in Birmingham and Newcastle, that he cannot be killed, he cannot be imprisoned only that he's begging. There must be law against begging, then he could be imprisoned, but still he had right for attorney. Imagine something that Slovaks didn't have in 19th century. Then they were accused of committing crime that was held in Hungarian, in Magyar language. They couldn't defend themselves. So something that we had already pretty late in 1919, 1920 with Czechoslovakia. So that's why this Habeas Corpus Act, Zákon Habeas Corpus, is so important, because even before the second revolution in England, with bringing new form of government, we have already law act that is protecting somebody's rights. So concerning civil rights, it is one of the most important moments in the history of the mankind. Okay, so in this moment we're coming to the second revolution. For me it is time to check out the time, which is about 14 minutes. For me it's really great, because I believe I will finish this first part, and if I have time I will explain you further things. Now the moment started. So when they banished James II from England, so what to do? What to do now? Shall we restore republic? But many people remember these bloody reprisals, so that like nevermore. That's why it is another thing that even today when somebody speaks about republic in England or in Scotland, so everybody got like goosebumps, like from fear about Oliver Cromwell and killing like thousands of people. Despite he made England great, but with like bloody hands. So for that reason, even they were later against French Revolution, for example. For that reason, the Parliament decided, so okay, but we have, when we try the Republic, we have another example, another form of government, and that's in their enemies, in the Netherlands. Netherlands, if you remember when we have this Reformation, so still it was sometimes kingdom, sometimes united provinces, sometimes it was republic. But the point was that almost all the time they had a king. But the king from this Orange family, from in English the Orange family, the House of Orange, were only formally regents of the kingdom. So somebody who were appointed to take care of the kingdom or take care of the republic. And they had to be approved, sometimes elected by the assembly of all the representatives of all the parts of the Netherlands, Zuid-Holland, Amsterdam, Overijssel, and many others. So even kings, despite that traditionally they were from the House of Orange, they needed to be approved by the assembly. And English look at them like, this is actually a cool idea for us, because when kings are used to be only the regents, and they are used to limited power, that every decision they did is actually a decision of the assembly, of the parliament. They are just formal rulers. They are there only to show people that we have somebody in there. But they had their own ministers, chancellors, and every decision is done by the parliament. And this sounds like really nice compromise for for the English Parliament. That would be actually cool situation. Because from English families or Scottish Steward family, there was still chance one day they can come back, claim the throne, restore the monarchy. They decide to offer the throne to these Dutch rulers of the Orange family, from the House of Orange, because the Dutch king refused that, and it would be actually bad decision, because immediately that would be unification of Netherlands and England. So they decided to offer it to vice-regent, vicekrál, so actually kind of palatine of the kingdom, as we call it from Hungary. Today we would call it like vice-premier, okay? And these guys, they were from the Orange family, but they promised never to claim the throne of England. And thus the throne was offered to the Dutch vice-regent, William III of Orange, as a wife, of course, to be the Queen of England, and Rex et Regina. Okay, so this is important. Beatles, I can read this, okay, in here, this part. But before accepting the throne, he had to accept the supremacy of the parliament about the king, and he needed to accept the division of power and some basic civil rights. For example, this habeas corpus act. But not only this one, because parliament find it like, okay, when kings will not resist, let's make more acts like this, and not only one act, but whole list, whole bill of acts, and they call it the Bill of Rights. Účet práv, alebo súčet práv. My to budeme nazývať listina práv, alebo the Bill of Rights, and for the English and later for Britain, it is something that is instead of constitution. It's not constitution, but it is list of basic acts that must never be broken in England. It was issued, accepted in 1689, and that's why new form of government that was installed started to be called as a second revolution, and made a comparison difference to the first bloody revolution. This was called glorious revolution, slávna revolúcia, because it was without blood, it was on the decision of the parliament and accepting of this guy, to be the king and with this power. Now this, as you can see, even with stain, the Bill of Rights was quickly signed up, and there are some extracts, so let's analyze them. The power of law is above the power of the king. It's not like in France or in Habsburg monarchy. I am the king, Leopold at that time, Leopold I. He was ultimate ruler. Nobody could challenge his power, like dragon Smaug, in The Hobbit. But the power of law in England is above the power of the king. That had been respected by Elizabeth, for example, by Charles II, but not by Charles I and James II. That's why there were these revolutions attempts. The parliament approves taxes. Why? Because Charles I wanted to increase taxes without parliament's decision. The king can't cancel or implement acts. Král nesmie rušiť alebo zavádzať zákony, because executive power and legislative power, it means making law, making acts, and implementing is in the hands of the parliament. Yes, they gave power to Oliver Cromwell, but that was bad experience. That's why king cannot implement acts. He cannot be the one who appoint the ministers. Ministers will be chosen by the parliament for him or for her today. The parliament approves the maintain of the army. The king cannot hold the army because kings, just like president in Slovakia, is the chief commander of, in this case, the British army. But he needs approval from the parliament. If the parliament doesn't do that, they serve in the military in the way like Elizabeth II. You know that parliament during the Second World War didn't give, even during the First World War. Actually, last 200 years, they never gave power to the king to be the chief commander of the army. They always gave it to the main minister. That would be called prime minister, po slovensky premiér, alebo predseda vlády. And he was the one. Winston Churchill, not George VI, defeated the Nazi, together with Americans and Soviets. The other thing in here, freedom of choice for the members of parliament was accepted. It means that when the MP, member of parliament, elects votes against the king's will or against even the decision of the parliament, he has right to do that, or she has right to do that. Even today, I cannot be happy about Marian Kotleba or Minho Mazurek sitting in the parliament, but they were democratically elected in the parliament, and thus they have right to be there and to have the freedom of choice, despite I may not like it. But this is democracy, and this is something that we need to accept. Okay. Of course, sometimes it may happen that there are too many people who want to pull down the system, the parliament, the democracy. If there were more Minos, Mazureks, like many eggheads, in the parliament, so probably that would be dangerous, because one day probably they would just banish it, dissolve it, and install some totalitarian, authoritarian government with their own political party, like we experienced it in the times of Second World War. So for that reason, sometimes it may happen that this freedom of speech is too much, because it can be dangerous for the country itself. Either fascists or communists or levelers or Jacobins from French Revolution, or maybe some other guys, crazy guys, So for that reason, they installed that freedom of speech in the parliament cannot be prosecuted by any other tribunal, only by the parliament itself. For that reason, even in our parliament, we have these committees, Parliamentary výbory, and one of them is only to decide whether the member of parliament didn't break the constitution, in this case the Bill of Rights, or didn't commit suicide, didn't commit any crime, because since he or she did commit crime, broke the constitution, broke the Bill of Rights, the tribunal of the parliament can decide that this MP can be listened, questioned in the trial just like any other citizen. For that reason, what is the reason? This is what we call immunity of the MPs. Many people dislike it, because anybody can accuse MP like he kidnapped me, he raped me, he harassed me, Robert Fico looking, Maria Koliko, or anything, and probably it's not true. But unless there is a tribunal, that is a trial, nobody can do that. But if somebody sends a lot of charges against the MP, he or she cannot work in the parliament properly. That's why there is committee of members of parliament, the MPs, who can decide whether, let's say, Minho Mazurek can be questioned, and he was accused of propagation of the movements and parties promoting breaking of civil rights. And that's the thing, okay? So if this is kind of like protection of the democracy of the parliament, because one day it can happen very easily that suddenly Bundestag in Germany can be ruled by Nazi, that State Duma, that is parliament in Russia, in 1970 can be overruled by communists, and very easily, because some army can come, take them to prison, and only communists left there. In Czechoslovakia, it happened in 1948. Those who didn't stand with communists were suddenly just imprisoned, killed, and communists ruled in here. And it couldn't happen in England since 1689 because of the Bill of Rights. As you see, freedom of speech is not unlimited, because this so-called Popper's paradox, Karl Popper was a famous philosopher who said that it's paradox, but if you want to protect the tolerance, you cannot be tolerant to everything, because those who disrespect the tolerance can abuse it and can bring it down. So for that reason, William of Orange, William III of Orange, becoming the new king of the new monarchy, a new type of monarchy in which he or she, they don't possess any real power. The parliament decides it and creates something that can be slowly called democracy. Not very open mind, but gradually more and more limited. So we have this House of Lords already deciding, and not the king. Yes, sometimes king can sit here, can give a speech, but this is all. So something new was established that we call the constitutional monarchy, čiže konštitučná monarchia. Zase tu je paradox v tomto pomenovaní, trošku prepnem na slovenčinu, pretože Konštitúcia znamená ústava, čiže ako ústavná monarchia. Nie je to celkom pravda, že by to bolo podľa ústavy, keďže Angličania nemajú ústavu, majú túto listinu práv, ale je to nejaký zákon, ktorý v podstate limituje a obmedzuje moc panovníka. So this is the type of monarchy in which the king or the queen, of course, rules only formally. So they don't possess any real power. So the real power is in the hand of the parliament that is elected by the people in here. So this form of government is very common in Western Europe. Even in here, more than 6 major European democracies have it. I didn't count the small countries. So as you see, England from those times, you have lines of these kings and Cromwell and his son, and William and Queen Mary of the Orange family. And even today, this is actually a situation today, you have Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Belgium, United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and Spain. Also you have, of course, the Pope, the Principality of Monaco, the Grand Duchy of Andorra, and Principality of Liechtenstein, but these guys are also they inherited the path from the Pope. But these are major democracies with constitutional monarchy. All countries really democratic, and only those who experience really I would say leftist revolution, they have presidential democracy. But I shall explain this presidential democracy next lesson, on next upcoming lessons, while talking about America, because it will be another inspiration and the form of government that we will be inspired. Not very much by English system, apart from maybe law, but it was first democracy of the world in these cases. Yeah, maybe the Dutch, like Peter van der Haas would claim that, yeah, but we had been there before. But unfortunately, we don't teach much about small countries in here, so that is the point. Still, one journalist claimed that was issued in Daily Telegraph in here when we have this. Or later, Fresh Widow and Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, passed some weeks ago, and probably new King of England in here. After Charles, as you see, that would be Charles III already, or the fourth, I'm not sure. So the journalist claim about Elizabeth II, we should all bear carefully in mind the constitutional safeguards inherent in the monarchy. While the Queen occupies the highest office of state, no one can take over the government. She's the last that will sign up the act, because she has right to do that. It's not normal, she cannot do that, but if you watch the TV series The Crown, you realize that her uncle, I believe, tried to seize power, made coup d'etat, because Labour Party was going to rule in England, and they were afraid that communism would be all around, and she stopped that. She stopped him, not the Labourists. And the Labourists were grateful monarchists in this way, because it was also democracy. And for them, even the Queen was the one that protected the subjects, poddani, of England, While she is the head of the law, no politician can take over the courts. She is the one that always approves the final signature while appointing the judges in the Supreme Court, but proposed by the Parliament, and she can refuse some of them. It's rarely to do that, but before that, the Prime Minister had to consult it with her. And while she had a lot of advisors, she can be the one that denies. Not because these people can be dangerous for democracy, for the Bill of Rights. While she's ultimately in command of the armed forces, no would-be dictator can take over the army. As I said, her uncle was very popular among this episode of The Crown TV series thought that he's giving a speech to either soldiers or veterans of the war, talking how they were fighting Japanese in the Second World War, in the Philippines, in Burma, on the road to Mandalay, giving famous speech, and he got support of the army that, with support of many businessmen, they were willing to take him up. And if the Queen, if Elizabeth II had supported him, so he would have been the new dictator, perhaps. But she refused that, and she persuaded him not to do that, because then United Kingdom wouldn't be democratic country. It would be country of the third world. like Chile with Augusto Pinochet, for example. The Queen's only power, in short, is to deny power to anyone else. Any attempt to temper the royal prerogative must be firmly resisted. So she, as a queen and next king, must protect the democracy, because this is the way, this is the form of government of England, despite being the monarchy now being ruled in here with different situation than in many other countries. That's why we learn about England, about Britain, and it's really important if you can't like trust, I don't know, some other countries, despite they are republics and there are some elections. But you know, if there is the same president for almost 30 years, probably it's not correct all the time, because nobody rules there for so many years. Okay guys, I just check out my time, which is 5 minutes extra, so I'm really sorry for that, guys. And when I uploaded this video, I will let you know that you can watch the end of this video later on. So I'm sorry for that. Now, next lesson I should shorten it for you. So next lesson will continue how England looked like and Great Britain was created in the 18th century, and how political systems came here. So that's all from me, guys. So stay negative in tests and positive in mind. Bye bye.